Okay, welcome to our fourth plenary event. It's been a great meeting so far. I've heard some conversations that I really don't think could happen at any other meeting. So thanks to all the participants who are making this such a great event. As has been the case with the other plenary events, we will begin with a main address by our speaker, Professor David Livingstone, whom I will introduce in a moment. His main talk will be followed by three brief responses. I'll mention the respondents now and then very briefly just invite them into the conversation later. So our first response will be from Alan Love. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota. Professor Love will be followed by Joshua Swamidass. Dr. Swamidass is an associate professor at Washington University in St. Louis, where he has dual appointments in pathology and immunology, as well as biomedical engineering. Our third respondent will be Hans Madueme, associate professor of theology at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. Professor Livingstone will have the opportunity for a rejoinder following the three responses to his address. After we have heard from all of them, it will be your turn to ask questions of our panel. I am so happy to introduce to you Professor David Livingstone. Professor Livingstone is a professor of geography and intellectual history at Queen's University, Belfast, where he did his own undergraduate and graduate studies. His scholarship varies widely, but he's generally interested in questions of the historical geography of science and religion. So he answers or pursues questions like who thought what about science and religion, where, when, why, and with what consequences. Professor Livingstone has received numerous awards. He was elected to be a Fellow of the British Academy in 1995, granted the title OBE in 2002 and CBE for services to scholarship in geography, history of science, and intellectual history. That was in 2019. He offered the Gifford Lecture at Aberdeen in 2014 and the Dudley Lecture at Harvard in 2015. He's held visiting professorships at Calvin, University of British Columbia, Notre Dame, and Baylor. Professor Livingstone has written and edited about a dozen books. Most have very interesting subtitles, which I won't read, but the teaser headline titles are things like Dealing with Darwin, Adam's Ancestors, Evangelicals and Science in Historical Perspective, and Darwin's Forgotten Defenders. I expect that some of those titles are familiar to many of you. So this morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are, he will be speaking to us on the subject of Tracking Adam's Bloodline, a case study on human origins. Professor Livingstone, thank you so much for being with us, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you have to say. The podium is yours.
Michael, thank you very much for the introduction. I was just reflecting before this session that it's actually 31 years ago, I think, that I gave a keynote address to the ASA when they had their meeting, I think, in Messiah College in Pennsylvania. So this is a very welcome return from me to the ASA. So thank you to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this session. And I'm very much looking forward to the conversation with my interlocutors in due course. Okay, so tracking Adam's bloodline. There is a very interesting passage in the 16th book of St. Augustine's City of God. Here, Augustine is discussing the problem of what used to be called, the monstrous races, namely strange varieties of human-like creatures that reportedly inhabited the fringes of the known world. Blemii, headless creatures with human bodies and faces on their chests. Cyclops, creatures with one eye in the middle of their foreheads. Cynocephali, human-like creatures with dog-like heads, and so on. Now, this raised a critical theological question. Were such creatures human beings, or were they not? Augustine's answer is crystal clear. Let me read just this little extract. Whoever is born anywhere as a human being, that is, as a rational mortal creature, however strange he may appear to our senses in bodily form, or color, or motion, or utterance, or in any other faculty, part or quality of his nature whatsoever, let no true believer have any doubt that such an individual is descended from the one man who was first created. Wherefore, to conclude this question cautiously and guardedly, either these things which have been told of some races have no existence at all, namely they're false, or if they do exist, they're not human races, or if they are human, they are descended from Adam. For Augustine, descent from Adam constituted a definition of humanness. In one way or another, that answer has echoed its way down through Western history, and sometimes with rather disturbing consequences. So what I'd like to do in this session is to chart something of this trajectory and to illustrate how the question of identity and genealogy was, and I believe still is, theologically and politically charged. So, genetics, Genesis, and genealogy. On the 11th of January 1988, Newsweek magazine ran as its cover story the results of a research project carried out by Rebecca Kahn and Alan Wilson on mitochondrial DNA. The gist of the findings was that because mitochondrial DNA is only inherited from our mothers and remains largely unchanged in transmission from generation to generation, it can be used to, and I quote, define the maternal lineages of living individuals all the way back to a common ancestor. The Newsweek headline screamed, "The Search for Adam and Eve." Mitochondrial Eve had appeared on the genetic stage, and the Newsweek report announced her arrival. Quote, "Scientists are calling her Eve, but reluctantly. The name evokes too many wrong images. The weak-willed figure in Genesis, the milk-skinned beauty in Renaissance art, the voluptuary gardener in Paradise Lost who was all softness and meek surrender and waist-length gold tresses, the scientist Eve, subject of one of the most provocative anthropological theories in a decade, was more likely a dark-haired, black-skinned woman roaming a hot savanna in search of food. She was as muscular as Martina Navratilova, maybe stronger. She might have torn animals apart with her hands, although she probably preferred to use stone tools. That's quite a gal." Now, it was only to be expected that Eve's annunciation would soon herald a hunt for her male counterpart. And sure enough, genetic research on the male sex-determining Y-chromosome, which is passed with little change from father to son, presently ushered humanity's most recent patrilinear common ancestor onto the scene. In October 1997, participants at a Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Symposium in New York were told that Y-chromosome Adam, there is Y-chromosome Adam, was an African, a finding that confirmed the Eve story. Adam and Eve, or at least their metaphorical alter egos, since they lived many, many years apart, had taken center stage in the human story once again. Now, it seems to me that Genesis narratives are invariably political, and genetics sagas, it seems, are no exception. Stephen Jay Gould, for example, rapidly recruited mitochondrial Eve in support of anti-racist politics. In 1987, for example, speaking on evolution and human equality, he concluded his expose of scientific racism by turning to what he himself described as the centerpiece of his argument, mitochondrial DNA. This, and he called it, tremendously important finding, he insisted, make us all realize that all human beings, despite differences in external appearance, are really members of a single entity that's had a very recent origin in one place. There's a kind of biological brotherhood that's much more profound than we ever realized. The political implications of Y-chromosome Adam were no less conspicuous. As the Stanford medical geneticist Peter Underhill observed, we are all Africans at the Y-chromosome level, and we are really all brothers. The ripples have quickly spread in other directions. The BBC News for the 10th of May 2000, for example, commenting on a related haplogroup research project centered on the Middle East, announced that Y-chromosomal research had shown how Jews and Arabs are genetic brothers. In these scenarios, common descent underwrites human equality. Adam's bloodline provides a compelling basis for a new politics of sisterhood and brotherhood. The genetic tracking of humanity's DNA all the way back to this Adam or Eve doesn't exhaust contemporary fascination with Adamic genealogy, however. Far from it, as I discovered to my great dismay one afternoon nearly 15 years ago. Sitting at this very desk, I was checking online used bookstores for literature on the subject, fully expecting to find nothing new. Suddenly, about a dozen titles jumped out of the screen at me. I was taken aback. I soon discovered that all of them were supplied from a single bookseller in Missouri called Westward Trek Books. A quick glance at the store's website made me realize that I was in contact with a white supremacist group calling themselves Kingdom Identity Ministries. They too, it turned out, were fascinated with Adam's bloodline, but for very different political ends from the geneticists. According to their articles of faith, some of which I have on the screen, the man Adam is the father of the white race only. And race mixing is an abomination, a satanic attempt meant to destroy the chosen seed line. Viciously anti-Semitic, the aim of this group is to separate out a pure white Adamic seed line and to dehumanize non-Adamic lineages. The group's virulent theology of race hatred declares Adam to be the father only of the white race. Other races of non-human pre-Adamic stock are described as the spawn of Satan. Now, for all its labyrinthine exegetical maneuverings, identity political theology is pretty simple. To this group, Adamic races are superior and are possessed of some intrinsic spiritual and cultural capacities denied to others. And so it's the duty of the Adamic race to keep its bloodline pure from pollution through interracial mixing. Bertrand Comparet, staged as a San Diego attorney, began one of his typical sermons with this assertion that the Bible is the history of our people, the white people of the race, that loosely we group under the term Anglo-Saxon. Within a few breaths, he was railing against the mongrelization of pure Adamites. Instances of this dreary refrain could be repeated ad lib. Pamphlets privately printed in the last 20 years or so have included titles like these: The Negro and the World Crisis, Racial Difference, More Than Skin Deep, Species of Men, A Polygenetic Hypothesis, False Biblical Teachings on the Origins of the Races, and so on. Their titles amply convey their sentiments. Now, many ironies, I think, attend these most recent mappings of Adam's genetic lineage, whether it's of the chromosomal or the so-called scriptural variety. Even while secular geneticists exult in tracing humanity back to a DNA Adam and Eve, the most right-wing fundamentalists are populating the human past with an entire suite of non-Adamic races whose malign seed continues to snake its way through history. Tracking Adam's bloodline, it seems to me, is critical to both of these enterprises, but for very different political reasons. Adam's ancestors. What I'm going to try to do today is to provide you with something of a genealogy of genealogy. The lingering allure of the idea of Adam and Eve, the fascination with bloodline ancestry, the passion to trace out different human lineages, and the resort to science or to scripture to justify racial politics continue to reverberate down through history to our own day. Here I want to pick out just a few dominant landmarks on the horizon and identify one or two of the spheres into which the idea of Adamic genetics in one form or another have been drawn. While the suspicion that Adam might not be the progenitor of all humanity goes back at least to the early Middle Ages and in all likelihood much earlier than that, I think it would be fair to say that it found its first sustained voice in the monumental heresy of a little-known French Calvinist, Isaac de la Pereire. In 1655, Pereire published his grand profanity, Pre-Adamitai, Man Before Adam, as the English version was entitled. In this work, the idea that human beings existed prior to the biblical Adam found its first sustained champion. The proposal was simple. Only the Jews were descended from Adam. All other peoples were derived from non-Adamic progenitors. On the surface, the Pereirean formula was an exercise in biblical hermeneutics. Internal matters of exegesis were thus to the forefront as Pereire sought to explicate a section of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. But external, anthropological and geographical data were even more decisive. He had culled pagan chronicles, genealogies, and Renaissance travel books in their search for supporting testimony for his theory. The consequences of this text were of epic proportions. This scheme queried the taken-for-granted relationship between nature and scripture. It was widely, therefore, condemned. Indeed, Pereire was arrested in February 1656 and was escorted to Rome, where he recanted before Pope Alexander VII. When he issued an apology for his theory, let's see if we can, yes. When he issued this apology, he all the same carefully constructed the apologia in such a way that he never actually denied his own theory. Clever devil that he was. Just how subversive La Pereire intended his proposals to be, however, is not entirely clear. Certainly, there are grounds for seeing this project as radical through and through. Leo Strauss, for example, judged that La Pereire was, and I quote, among the first of those who openly declared their departure from unquestioning acceptance of Scripture, and that his recourse to Scripture is no more than an adventitious trimming to a naturalistic and rationalistic theory. Read in this way, La Pereire pled midwife to modern skepticism. But there's some reason to suppose that Pereire's aim may not have actually been so subversive. As the Princeton historian Anthony Grafton puts it, Pereire hoped that by making Genesis a more reasonable text, he would make it more convincing, and thus the heathen would be more receptive to it and would would more willingly convert to the true religion, Christianity. Despite the aroma of heresy that long clung to pre-Adamitism, the theory did attract sympathetic advocates in succeeding generations, not least among those exploiting its potential for explaining racial difference. It's important, though, to stress that Pereire's own version was, so far as I can see, bereft of racial supremacism. While Adam was only the father of the Jewish peoples, Pereire believed that all nations would participate in the benefits of God's election of Israel. In its later incarnation, very different racial politics would, of course, be extracted from this theory. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, an acrimonious feud was engaged between those tracing humanity to a single point of origin and those advocating a multiple origins interpretation. One of the most conspicuous challenges to the traditional understanding of Genesis came from the Scottish jurist, Lord Keynes. Keynes, who in 1774 published his Sketches of the History of Man. Unconvinced by Montesquieu's environmentalism and by Buffon's resort to climate to account for human diversity, James was helplessly attracted to polygenism. To him, climate did not produce human variety. Rather, human varieties were created for particular climates. Griffith Hughes in the 18th century, a Welsh clergyman naturalist in Barbados and a fellow of the Royal Society, similarly told the readers of his Natural History of Barbados that the whites, the Indians, and the blacks differ not accidentally, but originally and really. Multiple human creations were also advocated by the English surgeon Charles White, who came to the conclusion that the various species of man were originally created and separated. In his famous account of the regular gradation of man in 1799, he reported that if all the racial varieties had sprung from a single source, he could find no way of drawing a stable boundary line between humans and apes. As he put it, if we admit that such great varieties can be produced in the same species as we find to exist in man, it would be easy to maintain the probability that several species of simii are but varieties of the species man. Needless to say, he abominated such an evolutionary conception. Now, while James's proposals were beginning to attract some staunch defenders, they remained deeply troubling to many, and not least to Samuel Stanhope Smith of Princeton. To Smith, Adam's blood ran in every human vein, at least metaphorically. To him, human variability was entirely explicable by environmental adaptation, and he vigorously protested the doctrinal propriety and scientific plausibility of this account. His motive for doing so, however, I think was less theological than it was political. Plural origins of the human race, Smith believed, necessarily disrupted the idea of a universal human nature and thereby subverted the very possibility of a public moral order. Here is how he put it in his famous 1787 essay on the causes of the variety of complexion and figure in the human species, may I say precisely at the time when the Constitution of the United States is being ratified. Let me quote, "The denial of the unity of the human species tends to impair, if not entirely destroy, the foundations of duty and morals, and in a word, of the whole science of human nature. No general principles of conduct or religion or even of civil policy could be derived from natures originally and essentially different from one another. But when the whole human race is known to compose only one species, this confusion and uncertainty is removed, and the principles of morals rest on sure and immutable foundations." A political protestation that a nation had to believe in monogenism if it was to maintain public order. Nonetheless, while efforts were made to maintain peaceful relations between anthropology and theology, versions of the pre-Adamite theory did begin to assert themselves increasingly throughout the 19th century. Take, for example, an 1856 volume entitled The Genesis of the Earth and of Man. The anonymous writer of this treatise is widely thought to be the Arabic scholar Edward William Lane. Lane's intention was to integrate biblical religion with recent ethnological findings, and in so doing, he turned to the pre-Adamite theory. To him, the pre-Adamite idea of multiple origins had considerable advantages, not least for philological concerns, and he launched an attack on the monogenetic account of linguistic development being put forward by such eminent authorities as Bunsen and Muller. His own formulation proposed a polygenetic taxonomy of language systems, which necessarily proposed, and I quote him, that there have existed pre-Adamites of our species. You can see from this that primeval languages come well before the Hamitic, Semitic, or Japhetic linguistic systems. Those come, of course, from the three sons of Noah. Lane's strategy was far from unique, but perhaps the most sustained mid-Victorian effort to use pre-Adamism to maintain the harmony of scripture and ethnology, as the subtitle of this work says, was by an Irishman by the name of Dominic McCausland, who brought out this book originally in 1864. McCausland's passion was to uphold the detailed accuracy of scripture in the face of challenges from both science and from textual criticism. If the standard monogenetic Adamic story continued to receive support, he argued, the assaults of the geologists, historians, archaeologists, philologists, and ethnologists would reduce the book of Genesis to what he called the fanciful speculations of some visionary mythologist. But happily, such a judgment would be too precipitate, for the biblical Adam was only the last of a series of human types that God had created. In McCausland's case, the pre-Adamite theory was deployed to safeguard the integrity of Scripture from the assaults of higher critics, a quite remarkable reversal of its earlier engagement as a source of skepticism. Now we have the Darwinian era. While on the surface, it might seem that the advent of Darwin's theory of evolution must have sounded the death knell to polygenetic speculations, in fact, it lingered long in the thinking of post-Darwinian anthropologists. What is also readily detectable is that among Christian writers, pre-Adamite theories began to be rejuvenated to meet the newest challenges of evolutionary theory. Typically, such champions severed pre-Adamism from polygenism by arguing that Adam had human or proto-human predecessors from whom he was descended. Take, for example, Alexander Winchell, a leading American geologist and Methodist whose Adamites and pre-Adamites of 1878 earned him considerable notoriety at the time, including, in fact, dismissal from Vanderbilt University, and in the past year or two, his name being removed from some buildings at the University of Michigan. Basically, Winchell proposed that humans had first emerged in Africa, were likely black, and were graced with what he called the divine spark of intelligence. He went on. The time arrived, at length, when under the law of progressive development, a grade had been reached nearly on a level with that of modern civilized man in respect to native capacities. Now appeared the founder of the Adamic family. His home was in Central Asia. By this move, Winchell opened up a pre-biblical chronology that could be exploited for scientific purposes. At the same time, he prepared the way for an apologetic use of the pre-Adamites as a strategy now, not for opposing science to biblical religion, but for harmonizing biblical anthropology and human evolution. Of course, that didn't prevent him from indulging in some crude racial stereotyping, and his text is replete with talk of black inferiority and disgust at miscegenation. Adamic bloodlines still mattered, and he could happily rail about the way in which certain groups had been adulterated with, forgive me, Negro blood. For such reasons, his name, as I say, has recently been removed from one of the residence halls at the University of Michigan. In the long run, pre-Adamism proved to be a tactic attractive to a variety of harmonizers. By now, the strategy was more or less exclusively restricted, interestingly, to theological conservatives, namely those for whom the idea of a literal Adam retained serious doctrinal significance. Their project to preserve continuity with their own religious traditions and at the same time to take paleoanthropology with real seriousness encouraged the thought that Adam, the first true human who shared the image of God, to think that that Adam was actually descended from pre-Adamic hominids. Arthur Rendell Short, for example, a distinguished surgeon, a vigorous apologist for evangelical Christianity, and the Royal College of Surgeons Hunterian professor, is illustrative. In the latter capacity, he took up the subject of the problem of man's origin in a volume on science and the Bible that appeared during the 1930s. Here he suggested that there might conceivably have been pre-Adamite creatures with the body and mind of a man, but not the spirit and capacity for God and eternity. Within a dozen years, by 1942, these speculations had become, for short, convictions. Now he was confident that the Neanderthals could well be pre-Adamite, and that it was likely that the biblical Adam had been formed by the infusion of spiritual qualities into some pre-Adamic creature. And then we bring the story even more up to date. Pre-Adamic hominids and modern evangelicalism. As the 20th century wore on, versions of the pre-Adamite theory surfaced among some prominent British evangelicals concerned to take seriously evolutionary biology alongside scriptural authority. The racial dimensions of the theory were now conspicuous by their absence. And to get just a flavor of this development, let me simply record the observations of three of the evangelical movement's leading intellectuals in the United Kingdom. First, Derek Kidner, who just passed away in 2008, his Genesis commentary, which came out in 1968. Let me quote, "If God initially shaped man by a process of evolution, it would follow that a considerable stock of near humans preceded the first true man, and it would be arbitrary to picture these as mindless brutes." Let me just say in passing that, interestingly, Kidner in this Genesis commentary actually specifically refers back to Isaac Lapeyrère, showing indeed the depths of his historical scholarship on this very topic. The second example is R.J. Berry, universally known as Sam Berry, celebrated geneticist at University College London and president of Christians in Science, ASA's UK sister organization. Sam just died a couple of years ago in 2018. Discussing pre-Adamic man, this is what he had to say. "Man is distinguished from the animals only in his spiritual qualities. Consequently, it is reasonable to suppose that God placed his image in an already existing animal." Now, a few years ago, when I was talking with Sam about all of this, he told me that he had had lengthy conversations with John Stott on this very issue, and that John Stott had come around to the view that Sam had been advocating. And indeed, John Stott, who died in 2011, evangelical statesman, had this to say in 1978 in a text that's designed for younger people to engage in, as it says, understanding the Bible. "My acceptance of Adam and Eve as historical is not incompatible with my belief that several forms of pre-Adamic hominid may have existed for thousands of years previously. These hominids began to advance culturally. They made their cave drawings and buried their dead. It is conceivable that God created Adam out of one of them." Now, two things are notable about these interventions. First, the very idea of a pre-Adamic hominid presupposed the continued centrality of the idea of a historic Adam for these three leading evangelicals. Secondly, they shared a determined effort to welcome the insights of evolutionary biology, even while retaining a conservative attitude to the creation narrative. Well, that's really the historical dimensions of this thumbnail sketch, and I just want to conclude with one or two thoughts on what I'm calling wider domains as I bring this talk to a conclusion. First, a word about harmonizing strategies. It's clear that the pre-Adamite theory acted albeit in different ways, as a strategy for harmonizing science and scripture. What is notable, though, is that pre-Adamism did not act simply as a conceptual bridge between two discrete spheres of knowledge and belief. Rather, it functioned as a kind of mold which sculpted both scientific commitment and theological conviction into distinctive shapes. Harmonizing schemes are not to be thought of as passively zipping together two disparate sets of beliefs. Rather, I think they are agents that actively fashion both scientific theory and religious doctrine into new forms. Scientifically, pre-Adamism, depending on the precise version that a person adopted, predisposed its advocates to certain explanatory alignments. For example, they frequently found themselves committed to particular theses about language origins, about the role of environmental modifications in organic history, about the fixity of type. By the same token, the scheme also had religious implications for the doctrines of the fall, what the image of God might mean, what the soul might be, and biblical hermeneutics. Harmonizing strategies, I want to suggest, are thus rarely single unit ideas. Rather, they are conceptual systems, packages of ideas that transform the very notions that they are trying to unite. Cultural politics. Our analysis of pre-Adamism shows that its history cannot be conducted, I think, simply on the intellectual plane of a dialogue between science and religion. From its earliest days, this particular pre-Adamite theory has been implicated in one way or another in cultural politics. The reason, of course, is that the story of Adam and Eve itself is pregnant with socio-political significance. The nature of human identity, the relations between the sexes, the unity of the human family, the genesis of hatred, the emergence of crime. All of these are incorporated into the Mosaic narrative. Any tampering with Adamic genealogy disrupts that settlement. The supposition of an inhabited world before Adam immediately raised profound anxieties about a common human nature and its political significance, the relationship between the Adamic family and their co-Adamite counterparts. Could they intermarry? And about who owns the biblical story. Is it just a Jewish story? Is it a global story? What kind of story is it? From its earliest days, pre-Adamite speculations were implicated in racial matters. But the trajectory has been entirely remarkable. Beginning as a theory to recapture the centrality of the Jewish experience in scriptural economy and global history, it has ended up as a weapon of flagrant anti-Semitism. Laperer cast Adam as the father of the Jews, with the pre-Adamites as the Gentile nations. Numerous other writers later followed his examples. Latter-day white supremacists presume the Adamic line to be Caucasian and to find justification in it for their reading of Genesis and for locating the Jewish origins in some act of interracial sexual union with corrupt pre-Adamites. The gross racism that came to monopolize certain segments of the pre-Adamite opinion thus marks a striking departure from its earlier incarnations, in which, notably in the case of Laperer himself, the purpose was to sweep all nations into the benefits enjoyed by the chosen people, the Adamic Jews. The genealogy of pre-Adamism traces out a path from communalism to elitism, from humanitarianism to bigotry. This thumbnail sketch of the fortunes of Adam and his ancestors speaks, I think, to the extraordinary persistence of the passion to track Adam's bloodline, and at the same time to the remarkable versatility of the idea that Adam's family tree might not embrace all branches of the human race. Born in sacrilege and nurtured in skepticism, the idea of pre-Adamic humanity came to reside in the writings of the most conservative theological writers, who found in it a means of accommodating their faith to science. Among other things, this highlights the contingency of labeling. from, at one point, heresy to, at another point, orthodoxy. No less remarkable is the realization that while the most conspicuous pioneer of pre-Adamitism, Laperoire, mobilized it in the cause of humanitarian universalism, it has been embraced right down to our own day as a means of legitimizing the grossest forms of white supremacy. With roots in the political theology of 17th century Messianism, it has become an ideological weapon in the arsenal of an ugly anti-Semitism. Championed by creationists and evolutionists alike, it has attracted the eye of both polygenists and monogenists and served their respective political preferences. But underlying all these variants, there remains a persistent suite of themes, a persistent sense that Adam's bloodline matters, that human origins and human identity go hand in hand, and that race, religion, and destiny are inextricably netted together. For these reasons, questions of human origins were never simply about science and species or about theology and texts. They were about society and sex, cultural identity and racial purity. They were about labor economics and voting rights. They were about the elaboration of moral maps of the globe, the ethics of plantation economies, the management of domestic polities. All of these were folded into the passion to determine just who was, and just as important, who was not of Adam's lineage. If, as Paul Ricoeur once observed, Adam's fall from grace is the anthropological myth par excellence, the mission to track Adam's bloodline must surely rank as the archetypal quest of Western culture. But the story doesn't even stop there. In a review of a book that I wrote on this subject some years ago, and which my interlocutors will certainly refer to, called Adam's Ancestors, Stephen Webb pointed ominously towards the future, and I end with this extract from his review. Adam's long shadow. Far from being an eccentric and obscure debate, the substance of the argument over pre-Adamites is still with us, and perhaps even growing in importance. Indeed, as genetic manipulation advances unabated, we might have to figure out who the pre-Adamites really were in order to determine where to draw the line between Adam's descendants and the post-Adamites that are lurking on the horizon. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. What a treat. Thank you for that thorough and insightful address. Our first response to the address will be from Alan Love. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Minnesota. Professor Love.
Okay, thank you, Michael, and thank you, David, for that plenary. I just want to highlight to all who are listening that the slides and a copy of my comments are available in the files section. So let me go ahead and begin. One of the most memorable book titles from the 20th century is Richard Weaver's Ideas Have Consequences. One need not agree with Weaver's analysis to adopt the title as a healthy credo, which reminds us that what is thought and expressed at one time influences what is thought and expressed elsewhere. However, as is true of all slogans, it tends to de-emphasize important features in achieving its singular result. And the inverse, the importance of antecedents, not consequences, strikes me as crucial in reflecting on Professor Livingstone's plenary. Ideas not only have downstream consequences, but also upstream motivations. Attending to their diversity and heterogeneity, how they are implemented, and why it matters is paramount. Livingstone's argument can be seen as a précis of his 2008 book, Adam's Ancestors. There he shows how investigations into the ancestry of Adam are shot through with a variety of provocations, grappling with scriptural references to pre-Adamite lineages, reckoning with peoples found in voyages of discovery and stories about their monstrous variation, digesting divergent Chinese and Egyptian chronicles of human origins and a fossil record of seemingly deep time, and jousting with biblical criticism that called into question the authorship and exegesis of early chapters of Genesis, among other passages. The significance of these provocations was always gauged in terms of prior motivations, whether to preserve a literal reading of Adam for soteriological reasons, negotiate the juncture between orthodox exegesis and textual analysis, undermine theological appeals to secularize history, or justify a conception of racial hierarchy. This latter motivation was all too present in most accounts, even in those that directly contradicted one another and long before evolutionary perspectives predominated. That is, those who argued against pre-Adamite lineages often invoked it in support of the reality of racial difference and hierarchy, just as often as those who argued for pre-Adamite lineages. Much of this argumentation urged that the very idea of pre-Adamites had theological consequences and scientific implications, as well as moral and political ramifications. Yet there was a binding motivational tie among many of them, a tie reminding us that tracking serves other ends than just ascertaining what really happened. Those in favor of pre-Adamite lineages pointed to the pluralist origin of humans and the natural racial divide that followed from this fact. Those against claimed moral high ground in keeping humanity unified, but then marshaled arguments about how differences of climate and processes of post-lapsarian degeneration differentiated the races and not equally. Defenders of the slave trade could be found on both sides. From Livingstone's book, quote, Scientific Anthropology Bestialized Slavery, Adamic Theology Sanctified It, end quote. The links between good science, orthodox theology, and morality were and are tangled and knotted in complex ways. A deep insight of Livingstone's historical narrative, one of many, is that identification and characterization of this shared motivation and its enduring nature through long periods of history and arguably its increasing manifestation. Cultural politics of racial hierarchies with white Europeans presumed as the pinnacle were ubiquitous. This endurance extends to today and is perhaps easier for us to recognize considering recent political trends in the United States. But we should not let politics distract us from the impact of this endurance on current forms of biological investigation. Racial typologies pervade contemporary genetics and genomics, infusing biomedicine and social science in a problematic fashion. Attending to motivations for tracking Adam's bloodline is important because these guide and animate different methods of tracking, weightings of which methods take precedent or have evidential heft, and distinct conceptions of what is being tracked. Take the example of Mitochondrial Eve. The use of maternally inherited DNA from mitochondria is processed with phylogenetic algorithms to track matrilineality. However, motivations burst through the skeleton of inquiry as researchers drew attention to their discovery by labeling it with biblical imagery, and then saw Mitochondrial Eve reproduced through a diversity of social and political lenses, a process they contributed to liberally. A similar pattern is observable for Y-chromosome Adam, where patrilineality is tracked, though with a different item, nuclear DNA, exhibiting different properties. The tracking methods for both Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosome Adam are genetic. What is being tracked? Well, matrilineality and patrilineality. However, notice this genetic evidence yields a distinct type of conclusion, a specific genealogy within a species. Swamidass has demonstrated how routine appeals to genetic ancestry, whether in terms of mitochondrial or nuclear DNA, are distinct from claims of genealogical ancestry. Given that specific elements of genetic evidence for direct ancestry, parent to offspring, dilute over time, having each generation, they are not well suited to establishing a claim of universal ancestry within a species. Universal common descent within a species is not relevant for most evolutionary biology because it is focused on populations and has no reason to isolate individual organisms in the past or establish the, according to Swamidass's language, true and complete web of biological parentage. Universal genealogical ancestors are ubiquitous and uninteresting. I think we can enrich the vocabulary related to this crucial distinction because different tracking methods focus on different claims of ancestry. They relate different items genealogically and involve different types of evidence that have an impact on what can be concluded. And I won't go over this table in detail, but it's just meant to represent some of that diversity when you start to look more carefully at how to answer these questions about what is being tracked and how it's supported. In addition to subtleties of tracking methods, there is a logic behind them worth noticing. Scientific practices of tracking involve proxies, measurements of specific properties that stand in for something else. Biologists use subsets of characters, parts, such as genomic sequences and their differing states to follow organisms or lineages, that is, wholes. In genomic analyses, some parts exhibit desirable properties to support inferences, such as the exclusive maternal inheritance of mitochondrial DNA, which then serve as proxies for the lineages studied, frequently in the absence of other parts, such as skeletal remains or cultural artifacts. When single characters are taken to represent a lineage, they are often reified as exemplifying the nature of the thing they represent. What it means to be human in many of these tracking methods is to have a particular complement of DNA, and by way of a positive justificatory feedback loop, encourages more inferences about lineages, that is, bloodlines, in terms of these proxies. Well, why should we care about the mixed motives and the multiplicity of methods exhibited in attempts to track Adam's bloodline? Clearly, Livingstone pulls up the rug to show the darker side of motivation, such as those of white supremacist groups that pertain to concerns about race mixing and foster a denial of the humanity of non-Adamic lineages. More broadly, I see two key reasons why it matters. First, it directs our attention to what drives our fascination with these questions: identity. What does it mean to be human? Theological answers that emphasize the imago Dei, whether attributes or roles, seem radically divergent from genealogical continuity or the ability to interbreed, as the biological species concept would suggest. Scientific stories are empirically grounded, though complicated and open to interpretation. Which concept of species should we adopt? More concerning to many is that these membership conditions are a thin gruel with respect to meaning and significance. There isn't much to work with in fashioning an account of who we are based on material continuity alone. The theological answers are also subject to different interpretations and difficult to pin down empirically, but their attractiveness and controversial status lies in the robustness of the accounts, whether in terms of our mission in the world or expectation for a relational existence. Questions of identity are deeply motivational. Second, mixed motives and multiple tracking methods reveal what is often at stake in controversies about identity questions, credibility, and authority. Do scientific and theological claims have credibility? And if so, do they merit equal or differential authority? Here we enter a broader space and therefore need only note that attempts to find harmony or discord among scriptural and scientific claims function, as Livingstone describes, quote, as a kind of mold which sculpts both scientific commitment and theological conviction into a distinctive shape, agents actively fashioning both scientific theory and religious doctrine into new forms, end quote. Although it is often assumed that credibility and by implication authority lies with the sciences in our current moment, the fact that scientists working on human ancestry invoked names from sacred texts indicates that the authority to be heard and appreciated rather than just funded, lies with the broader public, something recent science communication is grappling with in the wake of the deficit model's demise. In this respect, we need to expand Stephen Shapin's cheeky subtitle into a full-blown mantra. We should study science and theology as if they were produced by people with bodies, situated in time, space, culture, and society, and struggling for credibility and authority. Perhaps it is more poignant when talking about Adam's bloodline to be reminded of Shapin's main title, Never Pure. The phrase Adam's blood ran in every human vein cannot be taken literally. Blood is not transferred across generations. Bloodline is a metaphorical notion associated with lineages that frequently operates as a palimpsest. This is not a denial of Weaver's titular slogan. The ideas under discussion in these debates have consequences. However, upstream motivations should not be ignored. If, as Livingstone claims, quote, the mission to track Adam's bloodline must surely rank as the archetypal quest of Western culture, end quote, then we need to scrutinize the motivations at work in those who undertake the quest. Yaroslav Pelikan showed that images of Jesus reflected contemporaneous values and concerns at different historical and cultural junctures. Our efforts to track Adam's bloodline may ultimately reflect back to us more than we want to know about ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you for that perspective on the subject. Our next response is from Josh Swamidass, Associate Professor of Pathology and Immunology and Biomedical Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis. Josh, looking forward to hearing from what you have to say on the subject.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And I have to say that if you've not yet read Adam's Ancestors, I highly recommend it. It's probably one of the most important books on origins I've read. And that's not flattery. I really think it's a book that really needs to be picked up now if you haven't. I think the reason why it's been so important for me is that it really undoes an immense number of false assumptions on which a lot of conflict really currently depends. And towards greater ends, I'm one of these scientists that's actually a person in the real world. I'm a dark-skinned Indian in St. Louis, not that far from that place with the racist books where I'm living. And, origins often really seems like this internecine debate. It's very esoteric, having to do a lot of Western thinkers going back and forth. But what I found out in the history of origins and Livingstone's history is that actually origins is caught up with my own concerns about race and justice in a fallen world. Really, origins is how we struggled to make sense of the unity and diversity of humankind for a very long time. And, in that context, I want to point out that for centuries, the church stood against racist theories of origins with a confession of monogenesis, that we all descend from Adam and Eve. And for centuries, scientists' objectives. And now, and I think this is important, and it's a really epic twist, it turns out that for a long time, some theologians would really abandon monogenesis because of that, others would reject evolution, but now, evolutionary science, in some really critical ways that are fairly recent, really vindicates the doctrine of monogenesis. And I think that's important because how it ties into these larger questions about race. Now, there's these questions I just want to point to that are going to really guide my reading of both history and where the science currently is. I think the core questions for theology are, do we descend from Adam and Eve? Do we all descend from Adam and Eve? Two, from a scientific point of view, it turns out that that's not actually the most important question. The much more important question is, did their lineage interbreed with others? And then three, underlying all of this, and the reason why it becomes important, is these deeper questions about what it means to be human. And these are very theologically important, politically important, scientifically important. This is really the grand question, which we should really not really accept simple answers. We should know it's a little more complicated. Here's my reading of this. I really think the Genesis account is simple in many ways. It talks about Adam and Eve and all humans come from us, but there's a lot of questions that are there in the story, a lot of mystery. I think the real big challenge to the Genesis account wasn't from evolution. It was really from the discovery of Antipodeans about 500 years ago, where we realized that there's people on this other continent. Really, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, and that's the real theological problem that Pierre is dealing with. Not the existence of a continent over there, but the fact that there were people on that continent, and there was really no conceivable way to understand how they could have descended from Adam and Eve. And so it's really important to understand that polygenesis that he proposes is really targeted at that very contemporary theological, political, geographic problem. And this is where he proposes the idea, which actually seemed quite self-evident to most people, is that these people over there, they just don't descend from Adam and Eve. In response, most of the church just rejected this, and this is really where the doctrine of monogenesis is really formed. And I think people misunderstand it to be a statement about the past, but it's really a statement about the present. It's saying that everyone alive today descends from Adam and Eve. Those co-Adamites out there, they don't exist. And so pre-Adamites are not a valid explanation for co-Adamites because co-Adamites don't exist. So in historical context, I think the confession of monogenesis intends to reject the premise that some people in present day do not descend from Adam and Eve. Of course, polygenesis was taken up by scientists and colonialists anyways and metastasized into racist forms. And of course, monogenesis theories of origins can be just as racist. But in the Confession of Monogenesis, the church found its voice against many racist theories of origins. And what about the primordial past? In many ways, monogenesis actually accentuated those questions and really raised questions of how it could be. Now, where does the science stand on this? I would say that monogenesis is actually a very audacious claim about the world that had no scientific support. It's about as ridiculous in our moment as claiming that a population of Homo sapiens on Mars descend from Adam and Eve. There was not really any clear understanding of how it could be possible, yet that's really where theologians came down. And most science really through the ages has said no. But there's actually been a very large change in our understanding of that. I'm pointing to 3 books here. One of them is by me, but there's also Steve Olson's book from 2003 and also David Reich's book from 2019, which I think are all extremely important in this conversation. What we basically found is that humanity is far more connected than we had first imagined. Even the Americas were not isolated the way that we imagined. There's been long-term exchange across these places. And so it turns out, actually, that if Adam and Eve were real people in a real past, they'd most likely be ancestors of all of us. And that's true even if they lived just 6,000 years ago. Everyone across the globe would still descend by them by AD 1. We can't trace Adam's lineage, to be clear, with genetic evidence because it would still most likely be genealogical ancestors of everyone that leave us no DNA. They'd be genetic ghosts. The only catch is that in the primordial past, Adam and Eve's lineage would have had to interbred with others. But as I've already mentioned, that's not actually what monogenesis is about. That's an open question, a lacuna in the count that a lot of people wonder about for a long time before evolution as well. So I think biologos and evolutionary creationists are a really helpful dialogue partner in this because they really, really don't like monogenesis. They've been working hard to argue against it for a while. And that'll give a clarity on kind of where the scientific status of this stands. The argument they made for a very long time was that the genetic evidence demonstrates our ancestral population was never less than 10,000 for the last 18 million years. Therefore, we do not descend from Adam and Eve. The first point I want to make about it is that this first claim turns out to be false. That's just not true. And I'd point you to William Lane Craig's new book on this, where he really does a phenomenal job on the science and really explaining exactly what they got wrong in the science here. But even if we grant that that's true, a key point, and this really goes to my book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, is that the second part doesn't follow. Even if it's true that our ancestral population never dipped below 10,000, that doesn't mean that we do not all descend from Adam and Eve. Here you can see a population that is always large, and then there's a couple from whom everyone descends. And it turns out our best estimates say that it just takes about 4,000 years or so before a person in the past would become an ancestor of everyone. That's really fast, just 4,000 years. Just recently, they published a new revised version of this argument. The target's still monogenesis. What's really striking about this review of what genetics says about Adam and Eve is that it makes no mention that Adam and Eve would be ancestors of all of us. I won't get into all the details here, but we can say that that the first claim is nearly true. But the more fundamental thing, I would say, is how theological the second part is. And because of that, it doesn't really follow. And what they're doing here is using language and really tight use of language to direct attention to a very esoteric idea in population genetics, the esoteric single couple bottleneck. But if you look here, and you can see a bottleneck couple and a headwater couple, which couple is most important? Which couple is unique? Well, the fact of the matter is they're unique for different ways, and they're important for different ways. I think David Livingstone's reading of Augustine is correct. Augustine basically defines human as Adam and Eve and their descendants. And by that definition, we can understand the black dots here as people who are the descendants of Adam and Eve, the headwater couple, and the really critical progenitor couple, the sole and unique progenitors of all humanity, is actually the headwater couple, not the bottleneck couple. What's going on here is they're trying to use science as a way to make a theological claim with certainty that they really can't sustain. So I think what we're finding, though, when we actually look at a closer view of what evolutionary science has really come to, especially over the last 10 years, is something that looks very close to the Genesis account. Humans are not different types. We are really one race. And Adam and Eve, if they really exist, we all descend from them. You know, the history of origins, I think, is really critical because it unscrews a ton of false assumptions about monogenesis, the tradition, and also what really are the currents that are driving this. But I do think there's a payoff. I think origins, once again, can really bring us back to these grand questions of what it means to be human. We can engage the difficult questions of race and justice in a fallen world here. And in our moment, I really do see opportunity in recovering the doctrine of monogenesis. And in doing so, we might recover our theological voice on race. If Adam and Eve are real, then we really are bound together as their sons and daughters. And we can proclaim anew this truth, this time with scientists too, that we are one blood, one family, far more connected than it might first seem. We are one race, the human race. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Josh. Important contribution there, and great to hear perspective. Let me remind you again, be putting your questions in the poll feature and upvoting questions that you would like to hear the answer to. Our third respondent is Hans Madueme, Associate Professor of Theology at Covenant College, for a theological perspective. Dr. Madueme.
Thanks. Some years back, I was part of a group of faculty participating in a summer grant at Oxford University, hosted by Stan Rosenberg and the gang at Wycliffe Hall. It was Templeton funded and aimed at building bridges between the humanities and the sciences. Part of our time, we heard lectures from specialists in science and religion, and one of those lectures was by David Livingstone. It was good to meet him in person, having read most of his books touching on the historical relationship between evolution and faith. Virtually everything I know about Isaac LaPerere, I learned from Richard Popkin and David Livingstone. I remember David gave a stimulating talk during that summer covering similar topics to the paper we're discussing today. At the end, I asked him a question. I loved the lecture at the descriptive level, but wanted to hear more at the prescriptive level. Not least, what does this all mean for Christian faith today? What are the main implications for 21st century believers? As I recall, David didn't quite answer my question back then, so I'll try again to find out what he really thinks. Take two. It seems to me there are two basic ways to interpret the significance of David's work on Adam. The first interpretation fits loosely within the demythologizing Adam project. This is one big happy family that just keeps growing. Biblical scholars telling us that Adam wasn't necessarily the first human being. Genesis 1-11 is not historical in a meaningful sense. Even the Apostle Paul's opinions about Adam are merely part of first century Second Temple hermeneutical tradition, and so on. Christian scholars theorizing in the wake of 1859 are telling us that the pre-modern view of Adam is now impossible. Adam and Eve had to die historically so that 1,000 new theories could rise up from the ashes. According to this first interpretation, David's work fits seamlessly within these trends. There is no man behind the curtain. Adam is a figment of the Western Augustinian imagination. David's historical case studies reveal how different protagonists invented or constructed their own Adams to suit their ideological purposes. But it's social construction all the way down. As Christians, we need not think that our faith commits us to a single couple from whom all humanity descends. The historical twists and turns that David so expertly chronicles are grist for the mill. They tell us nothing about a real historical Adam. Such a fellow never existed. Rather, they reflect what people believed and argued over, with Adam as a kind of epiphenomenon. So much for the first interpretation. Let's move to the second way of making sense of David's work, namely, as a striking vindication of the traditional understanding of Adam. Everything in his book, Adam's Ancestors, is just a series of footnotes to how Christians wrestled with the authority of God's word and the role of dogmatic rank. On this second view, David's work reminds us, indirectly, that the God of the universe, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, is wonderfully alive, and the powers of darkness are alive as well. We, members of the human race, are estranged from our Maker, a predicament that traces back to a historical individual who is biological or genealogical father of us all. It's no surprise then that over the centuries, so much ink has been spilled, so many theories floated about Adam and Eve. That's precisely what you would expect from two people so pivotal to the biblical story, which is the story of all people. So let's tease out this second interpretation further. Here's how it gives David's historical narrative a kind of prescriptive gloss. Over the first 16th to 17th centuries AD, we see the primacy of the traditional Adam in the West. He plays a central role in the biblical narrative, and that understanding shaped the ancient and then the Western intellectual tradition. Then, with La Pereire, the voyages of discovery, pagan chronologies, and so on, all of that starts pushing back on the traditional Adam. The empirical evidence against Adam keeps mounting and becoming more and more convincing. That's why La Pereire and his pre-Adamites were so controversial. This was a battle over the authority of Scripture. It was a question of epistemic authority. Scripture versus extratextual data. And the winner is ... Now, granted, La Pereire and other early critics were also asking questions internal to Scripture. Who lived in the city of Nod? Whom did Cain marry, etc.? But arguably, those questions were largely a pretext for the extra textual pressures they were feeling. Then comes Darwin and the whole question of evolution. Here things get a bit strange. Why were very conservative Christians, the people whose forebears thought La Pereire was a raving heretic, why were they now defending the pre-Adamite thesis? Is it then social construction all the way down? Is Adam just a figment of our collective imagination, someone we can mold to suit our current intellectual fashions? Well, no, not at all. What seems at first ironic becomes perfectly explainable. And here we need the concept of dogmatic rank. Once Darwin threw down the gauntlet, as it were, the Adam and the whole monogenism versus polygenism issues were no longer the most pressing questions threatening the integrity of the faith. There was bigger fish to fry. The late 19th and early 20th century religious thinkers, to those thinkers, Darwin's thesis threatened the very existence of God and his relationship to the world. It threatened traditional notions of the human person, and it threatened the inspiration of Holy Writ, just to name three. So doctrinal innovation at the lower level was fine as long as it was safeguarding these issues of higher dogmatic rank. Thus, the fact that conservatives were suddenly invoking the pre-Adamite thesis apologetically was perfectly consistent, whether we approve of their specific strategy or not. It was still the same story of faith-seeking understanding, believers trying to interpret their world in light of Scripture, picking their fights according to dogmatic rank. They were simply using the pre-Adamite thesis for those larger ends. But then what about the fact that David's narrative showcases so many conflicting, contradictory, and counterintuitive case studies? Again, no problem. That all fits hand in glove with this second interpretation. Think about the historical Jesus. I'm assuming most of us here at this conference take Jesus to be as real and historical as can be. And yet, the academic quest to uncover the historical Jesus has been fraught from the beginning, especially in the early 20th century. George Terrell's quip about Adolf Harnack could be applied to all the other questers. I quote, "The Christ that Harnack and other questers see, looking back through 19 centuries of Catholic darkness, is only the reflection of a liberal Protestant face seen at the bottom of a deep well," end quote. Jesus is the whole point of the biblical story. He's so significant to the cosmic spiritual warfare that we are caught up in. It's no surprise that we find a maze of conflicting opinions about him. So too with Adam. Adam is not as significant as Jesus, but we see the same dynamic of inspiring a welter of confusing assessments. The diversity of opinions is, at least in part, symptomatic of the very high spiritual stakes involved. But then you're saying, what about the white supremacists that show up in David's narrative? How could that mess possibly fit with the traditional understanding of Adam? In a word, seamlessly, right? Because, of course, as Christians, we have this problem of sin. And classical Christians, both East and West, have always believed that sin entered the world through Adam. They disagreed about original guilt and precisely how to tell the story, but they were united in the conviction that Adam brought sin and death into the world. And that's why men and women sin against God. We think and we speak and we do ungodly things, alas. White supremacists, then, are precisely the kinds of descendants of Adam one would expect in a post-lapsarian world like ours. It should not surprise that such people with an anti-Christian ideology would hitch their wickedness to the founding narratives of Christianity. After all, it's a perfect way to legitimize their moral madness. If they can ground their ideology in Eden and in Adam and Eve, then so much the better for their cause. It's rank opportunism. It's the noetic effects of sin. It's diabolical. But again, it's not surprising in light of the traditional understanding of Adam and the world he bequeathed us. Okay, those are roughly the two basic ways of reading David's paper. If you've read any of my work, then you know I'm a dinosaur in the second camp. I think of Adam much like pre-moderns and the classical tradition thought of him. But who cares what I think? I'm not the Irishman with the mellifluous brogue accent. What does David think? Which way should we read his work? The first or the second? Or does he command a more nuanced third way? We're not interested in the missionary. Will the real David Livingstone please stand up? Thank you.
Okay, that is a provocative transition now back to Professor Livingstone. We'd love to hear your thoughts on our three respondents' comments, please.
Michael, thank you. And thank you to the three commentators. These very rich and very different reflections on my little efforts here. They all say so many important and significant things that what I've simply done is try to focus on more or less a single issue that comes out of each of the three commentaries and why they're important for me. And I'm going to take these in reverse order. First of all, because I read them in reverse order, since I didn't know what order they would come in before the before we went online today, but also because as I do this in reverse order, it will lead up to a personal dilemma that someone like me has in our current political and cultural climate, and would, if you run out of questions and everything else, welcome some thoughts on that when I get to it. So, Hans, first of all, it is, of course, very good to see you again. I'm not sure, Hans, that we haven't met at least twice before, and certainly we had some discussion about evolution and Warfield in the past. And I see, Hans, you're still looking for the real David Livingstone. This is your second attempt, you tell me. And my quick answer is going to have to be maybe third time lucky. Not surprisingly, as a theologian, Hans is looking for something normative, something prescriptive out of my historical reflections. And I put it another way, I think he's on a hermeneutic quest to pin down the motivations, to use sort of Alan's, some of Alan's words, the motivations of this particular author. Fair enough. But before I would even get to answering that, my question really is, why does this matter? Why does he want to do this for this particular text? Why would the personal opinions of a mere historian in the midst of all you theologians and scientists really matter? So a couple of questions for Hans as I think about this. Suppose, Hans, you could classify me as one of those within what you call the demythologizing Adam project. So what difference would this really make to how you read my narrative? And what difference should it make, if you were to discern that, to how you read my narrative? How would it change your observation that the historical case studies I presented, and I quote you, reveal how different protagonists invented or constructed their own Adams to suit their ideological purposes? I think it would hardly matter which of the two groups you were in if one wanted to still outline how different protagonists on both sides chose to construct what they thought Adam was, irrespective of the empiricism, of the empirical facts of the matter, if I were to declare them. On the other hand, suppose I were to say, Hans, I'm going to join you as the second dinosaur in the second camp. Would I now have moved from a position of being an opponent of yours to being an ally in your cause? What difference would that make to how you've interpreted the narrative I present? And of course, it could be that I haven't really made up my mind on which of these to support. It could be that I want to be empirical about it, but theologically responsible at the same time. Well, then, what then? So all of this is a way of asking what difference classifying the historian makes to your hermeneutics here. Because like definitions, classifications wield cultural power. They police scholarship by determining who is in or who is out of some hermeneutic circle. One thing I'm convinced of, though, is this, that whatever side you or I or anybody else takes on that classification, all of us need to be made far more aware of the darker side and the complications of the Adamic narrative and its ongoing legacy. Those are my initial thoughts, Hans. Thank you for a typically provocative and interesting set of thoughts. Josh, I'm very grateful for your reflections on this, Josh, and I'm going to confess right up that I have not followed in anything like the superb detail you have, the literature on genetic bottlenecks, and I'm very interested to hear what you have had to say and what you've published on that subject. So, but for the interest of time and the conversation, I just want to dwell on one point, which I think is perhaps your main point, and it's the title of your response, which I believe is Evolution Vindicates Monogenesis. Now, here you make an observation. I'm going to quote you, Josh. For centuries, the church stood against racist theories of origins with a confession of monogenesis. We are all descended from Adam and Eve. But now you're pleased to report, and I quote you again, in an epic twist, it's evolutionary science that vindicates the doctrine of monogenesis. Now, I think, Josh, you're sure that there's theological significance in this recent twist, but you also welcome it from the perspective of, I think you refer to rebuilding a Christian voice on race and contributing to your concerns about race and justice in a fallen world. I think that you say this even while you're conceding that monogenesis can be racist. And I have to say, indeed, yes, indeed. So let me focus on that aspect of your contribution, because I think the story here is actually pretty complicated. So really 2 points. First, evolution and monogenesis. The relationship, I think, between evolution and monogenesis has never been clear-cut. We need to recall that polygenism really persisted for a long time within Darwin's supposedly monogenist evolutionary paradigm. Thomas Henry Huxley, for example, saw Darwin's theory of natural selection as reconciling and combining, and I quote him, all that is good in the monogenetic and polygenetic schools. He said that in 1865. The good that he saw in polygenism, and maybe evolutionists need to hear this, was the recognition of irreversible difference and the inequality of the races. Indeed, my good friend Nicholas Rupke, highly distinguished historian of science, once told me that he first encountered polygenism within Darwinian evolutionary theory, not from outside it. Now, given this, and given the multi-regional hypothesis of human origins, as opposed to the Noah's Ark theory championed by Milford Wolpoff and Alan Thorne, it's clear that there remained a lot of polygenetic thinking within evolutionary theory. I should add that these latter advocates of polygenism argue strongly that polygenism did not necessarily equate with racism at all. Whether they are to be believed or not is another story. Now, there are troubled waters here. Take the recent spat in the journal Science over the 150th anniversary of Darwin's Descent of Man. In an editorial from May 2021, the Princeton anthropologist Agustin Fuentes lauded Darwin's achievement, but he paused to draw attention to the racism that was inherent in the descent of man. He had in mind Darwin's portrayals of the indigenous peoples of America and Australia as having less capacity than Europeans, and the ways in which Darwinian language was used to justify imperialism and colonialism. The subsequent letters to the journal that he received from a number of high-profile scientists is a wonder to behold. This includes Jerry Coyne, Sir Walter Bodmer, and many others, disclosed great dissatisfactions with Fuentes' judgment. Among their concerns was the fear that his exposition would, and I quote them, encourage a spectrum of anti-evolution voices and thereby damage the next generation of evolutionary scientists. Discussing these things about the racism of science is a troubled water. Now, second, Christianity and monogenism. Now, as you've already admitted, this relationship is not straightforward. I think you're absolutely correct about that, and I think we do need to hear this. I think your hope is that what I'll call the new monogenism that is emerging out of the bottleneck work that you've been referring to, I think your hope is that that may combat racism and reassert the belief that we're all bound together as sons and daughters of Adam and Eve, that we're all one blood, one family, one race. I would love to think so. But racial equality and justice just simply have not followed from that doctrine, at least universally. Take the rank racism of Christian slaveholders in the Old South, despite their staunch resistance to polygenism, particularly the anthropology of Knott, Glidden, and Agassiz, and the robust defense of universal descent from Adam and Eve. A number of conservative theologians published books with titles like The Christian Doctrine of Slavery. People like Robert Dabney and George Armstrong and John Girardeau in the American South certainly thought that polygenism was wicked and that evolution was anti-biblical. But they didn't think that slavery was either of those. To the contrary, they argued that slavery was endorsed in Scripture, and they went through every verse in the Bible that contained words like slave, love slave, servant, servitude, and the like. They never found these condemned in Scripture. So this is only a way of saying that on both accounts, I think the story is complicated on the relationship between the history of evolution theory with its supposed early monogenism and polygenism, and then your more recent account of the reemergence of a polygenetic account, but also within Christianity and monogenism. I would love to have seen it equating with racial equality. I don't think that has persistently been the case. Alan, thanks for that very astute set of observations. I find myself hugely in agreement with your observations. Your foregrounding of the importance of motivations and the link between motivations and methods seems exactly right to me. I wish I could have done it as well in the paper as you've done in your commentary. I also, of course, totally agree with your thoughts on downstream and upstream consequences. And I'm going to quote you back. I thoroughly approve of your comments, and I think we all need to hear this, and I'm going to quote that the links between good science, orthodox theology, and morality were and are tangled and knotted in complex ways. I want to focus my remaining thoughts just on your idea about mixed motives and motivations, if I may. It turns out that ferreting out motivations can be a very tricky business, and not least in the cancel culture in which we currently live. Sensitivities on all sides make this a quagmire. I've already mentioned in my response to Josh a moment ago some prickliness in regards to comments on Darwin and race. Let me just stay in the same territory. Darwin's uncle, Francis Galton, was a founder father of modern eugenics, and developed regression analysis as a statistical means of examining what he considered to be the degeneration in the quality of English families. Darwin's son Leonard became president of the Eugenics Education Society, and his other son George was a member of the Cambridge University Eugenics Society. It turns out that Sir Ronald Fisher, a key architect of the modern synthesis that used mathematical models to integrate Mendelian genetics with Darwin's selection theories, was mentored by none other than the eugenicist Leonard Darwin. He too was deeply committed to eugenics, and it's been argued that this was crucial to the fundamental contributions he made to genetics and to the development of modern neo-Darwinism. Recall, too, that Theodosius Dobzhansky was a member of the board of directors of the American Eugenics Society. And I've heard it said that because Charles Darwin married his own first cousin, Emma, that he was persistently on the lookout for evidence of degeneration among his own children. Is there a pattern here? No matter how you look at it, it seems that eugenics, Darwinism, and genetics just were closely intertwined, and perhaps motivationally. Figuring out motivations is vitally important. But of course, it isn't straightforward. There are pitfalls here. On the one hand, Ernst Mayr insisted that eugenics was never anything other than a mere context, not constitutive for the development of biological thinking, and therefore could never be seen as part of evolution's lofty intellectual genealogy. That, in other words, could be left out of the mainstream story. On the other hand, Gonville and Keyes College in Cambridge, under pressure from anti-racist activists, has just recently removed a window commemorating the research of Sir Ronald Fisher because he was involved in the eugenics movement. Now, I want to use that as a segue to my own personal conclusion, with thanks to all of you for those insightful observations, and my apologies for not dealing with them at the level and extent that they deserve. You've all been kind to me, and for that I'm grateful, but particularly grateful for it in the context of this lecture. Let me explain why. Doing contextual history has been a rewarding experience for me, but contextual history can be a struggle too. Back in the late 1980s, before anybody was woke, I was working on science, race, and religion. I recall presenting a paper at an academic conference where I quoted some pretty nasty racist comments by early 19th century anthropologists and reproduced one or two images from their works. By doing that, I was accused by someone in the audience of actually reproducing racism itself. I found this bizarre and tried to forget about it. Then, none other than the American Philosophical Society refused to publish an 1830s image that I wanted to use in a monograph on the subject on account of it being offensive. I acquiesced. But I found this strange, as I was actually using the image to subvert the racism that was in it and to show how science, no less than religion, could be implicated in racist sentiments. What does a contextual historian do? How then should we live? All of this goes to show, it seems to me, that finding the fact of the matter and communicating your finding of the fact of the matter are now equally problematic. It is, Alan, can I say, a pure and simple truth that finding and communicating the truth is, if I can quote Oscar Wilde, from whom Steve Shapin got that title, the simple truth is that finding truth is rarely pure and never simple. Thank you.
Wow, what a rich conversation. Let's bring the audience in here now. I'll be selecting questions from the poll tab over here. I'll prioritize highly ranked ones, but if something down a little bit seems particularly relevant, I might jump around a bit. First question, a lot of people want to hear about this, and I think we'll direct this to David first. I think it maybe if you could bring in the perspective of the 20th century figures that you mentioned. Maybe see if they've written anything on this question, and then we'll hear from the others as well. The heart of the debate about polygenism versus monogenism seems to rest on the assumption that species are fundamentally distinct, immutable, and not able to reproduce with other species. However, with the advent of evolutionary science, this is no longer the case, as species is more continuous rather than discrete spectrum. Still, traditional Christianity, thinking of the figures you mentioned here, David, traditional Christianity seems to insist on the distinctiveness and special status of humans over other animals. How can we reconcile these two ideas, which are seemingly in tension?
Okay, well, thank you for that question about the assumption being that species were immutable and that we really ought to be more nominalist in our approach to species because there are no boundaries and it's all gradations and so on. If you take that far enough, also then it's gradations the whole way back to pre-hominids, apes and the like and so on. I think Darwin himself was fully aware that, as I think Ernst Mayr was inclined to put it, that he was really a population thinker, and therefore that species were not to be thought of as having these fixed lines between them, but it was really more ways of speaking about population groups and so on. Having said that, in the 20th century, some very celebrated evolutionary biologists, paleoanthropologists, and the like, have said that, of course, while at one level that is true, certain features have tended to become fixed in varieties, such that Stephen Jay Gould published an important paper with the interesting title, "Species Are Not Specious." That is to say that there is still something that we can think of with respect to species as discrete population units where questions of interbreeding and fertile offspring and so on still make sense. The second thing that I would say is that even those who, like Darwin himself, who certainly believed that there was a continuum, I think, amongst all organic life, did not prevent him for a minute from seeing that varieties could possess features that one might really almost think of as distinct species, whether he was talking about the pigeons or whether he was talking about other races. But I think some of the others who are more engaged in the empirics of science might have something more to say about that.
Great, thanks. Anyone from the panel want to bring in maybe a more biological perspective on that?
Can you repeat the question for a sec?
Yeah, so kind of a long question here, but it seems like the debate of polygenism versus monogenism assumes that species are immutable, but evolution kind of contradicts that. So Christianity insists on the distinctiveness and special status of humans. How can we reconcile that?
Yeah, so the way I see it is that there is a common feature between polygenesis, racist forms of polygenesis and racist forms of monogenesis. In the sense that it's not actually about fixity of species, it's really about how long things have been separated and how quickly they can change. So everyone who affirms evolution thinks that we had a common ancestor at some point in the past, right? But if that was so far in the past that the rate of change is enough that you can still produce distinct populations, then it becomes a polygenesis theory. And some people who are monogenesists, even if you think Adam and Eve is very recent, let's just say 6,000 years ago, but you think the rate of change between populations and the amount of separation is great enough, then you can create something that's essentially racist. So I think for that reason, anything that shows that the rate of change is slower, or that shows that it's not separated, so it's a shared change, or that shows that the commonality was more recent, ends up subverting a racist views of origin. And so that's, I think that's how I would say it. It's kind of a balance between those three variables. And that's why you can see racist versions of monogenesis, and why I would say even Gould mentions, I don't think 150,000 years ago is recent, but he says very recent. The reason why he's emphasizing recent for Mitochondrial Eve is he's trying to have that to be a small number and compared to the amount of change. And that's why I think it becomes very important. The way how people are currently talking about race and biology now isn't that there isn't differences between different populations, but that we're linked in a common evolutionary fate by a great deal of interbreeding. And so what that means is that the amount of our connection is far more recent than than the rate of change. Therefore, we end up being a single biological unit.
So I would just very quickly add that the philosophical kind of angle on this to remember is the difficulty of defining species and having a single working species concept is a long-standing discussion in the biological sciences. It's by many counts, there's more than 20 different operational definitions of species that are swirling around in research. And I think what I would drive us back to in thinking about this question is whether or not one thinks that you're going to get a special kind of credibility from the claims of science about what counts as a member of the human population for theological purposes. And I think here I would point people to some discussion in Josh's book because he picks up on this question explicitly. And I think sometimes there has been an assumption that one would be able to walk over to the shelf of science and pull off the right definition that will reinforce the pre-existing conception without understanding that the sciences don't deliver in that sort of way. So it kind of pulls us back to being careful about, before we engage in a project of sort of reconciliation or harmony, we ask, why are we doing it? And why do we think that a particular strategy of doing that is the right way to proceed?
Great. Thanks for that contribution, Alan. That was kind of an alarming lesson for me from David's paper of the extent to which our selection of scientific theories might have more to do with our politics than we might admit. Question here for Josh. Venema makes the following claim, quote, "The hypothesis that humans descend solely from one ancestral couple has not yet found any experimental support. Do you agree that there is, as of yet, no positive evidence for a single progenitor couple?"
Well, to be clear, that's not the only statement that Venema makes. He also makes a statement that he has a lot of evidence against it. And he equivocates these things. So given how he deploys that language, I completely disagree with that claim, because he means that as equivalent with saying he has a ton of evidence against it. And he claimed to, and he just didn't have any evidence against it. In fact, he had to rely on my work to find any evidence in supporting some of his claims. But the bigger issue, I think, is that there's a lot of equivocation, not just there, and in other ways that there's ways to read that I think are legitimate where I would not agree. I think that there's a great deal of scientific evidence that shows that the picture of human populations that he had just turns out not to be correct. And that's okay. I mean, we all are learning about this stuff. My biggest concern in it is when there's been large statements made about evidence that disproves particular theological views, and where that is just not true. That's my main concern, that I don't think that scientists really have the right to.
Great. Thanks. Question here for David. David, I think many of us were alarmed by some of those racist images and theories that were being pushed by Christians. How do the Christian white supremacists deal with the fact that Jesus is clearly a Jew? Do they try to reconcile it?
That's a great question. In fact, I haven't seen them trying to, the bits of it that I've read, I haven't seen them dealing with that question really at all. But of course, it's long been possible for people to be enthusiastic about the ancient Israelites and to be anti-Semitic in their current situation. So, for example, the British Israelite movement in the 19th century was very concerned to try to make it appear to be the case that the Anglo-Saxons were the true descendants of the ancient Israelites, and that modern Jews weren't really Jewish in that biblical sense at all. So there's all kinds of hermeneutic maneuverings and twistings back and forward simply to find ways of justifying a certain position that people adopt. I found reading that kingdom identity material deeply, deeply disturbing. And I came on it when I was in the late stages of writing Adam's Ancestors, and I discovered all sorts of things about this, that they were mailing out to people racial genealogies of white people in a huge chart, mailing it to I think it was people perhaps was it North Dakota or something of that sort, and many of these people ended up in prison. But I was shocked at the virulence of race hatred that was distributed there, and the theories that they have are genuinely conspiracy theories of the worst kind. Let me just recommend a terrific book on all of this by my good friend Colin Kidd, which I think is entitled something like Ethnic Theology or something of that sort. Colin's book is a fabulous examination of the way in which the idea of identifying Christianity with any particular racial group has been a very typical thing that's happened throughout history.
Great, thanks. I'm gonna go down one question, maybe two here. I want to get Hans in on the conversation here. Hans, you mentioned some things on which Eastern and Western Christians agree. A question here that's received several votes says, we're speaking here of the Western theological tradition. I think you explicitly kind of addressed a little broader perspective. But somebody's asking, how do the Eastern Orthodox and Muslims handle Adam and Eve and evidence of pre-Adamites? So Hans, I don't know if that's within something you can address, or maybe give you a first crack at it and then throw it out to the whole panel.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in my experience, from what I've read, the Eastern Orthodox, just in general, Eastern Orthodoxy is just a very conservative tradition, and they just don't like changing at all, and sort of like to stick with the church fathers. But there are theologians and scholars who are working in Eastern Orthodoxy and science. And from what I can see, it's fairly similar conversations. You do have some Eastern Orthodox theologians who are kind of wrestling with the pre-Adamite thesis or just evolution in general and trying to find out ways to reconcile the two. And then you're going to have at the lay level people sort of pushing back what the academics are saying. So from what I can see, it's pretty much reproduces the similar kinds of conversations among Protestants and Catholics. So, and I'm trying to think, I want to say Christopher Knight. There's one particular scholar that's written a lot on this. I think his name is Christopher Knight, but if David or someone has that, but yeah, those are the thoughts that come to mind.
Great, thanks. David, I realize it's a bit outside your research program, but have you come across any Muslim thinkers or Eastern Orthodox?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know any comprehensive answer to that question. It's important. I do know that there has been discussion of non-Adamic humanity within certain aspects of Islam. How widespread it is, of course, I don't know. But there are all sorts of counterintuitive things that happen here, and they're interesting questions. Just move it slightly. For example, Ron Numbers once told me that he had found a creationist tradition within Hinduism, which seems to me kind of a strange thing to find, but certainly would be there. I think also, and I haven't really pursued this, I imagine that there is something of a pre-Adamite tradition within Judaism, and I suspect that there may well be some, but I would, like Hans, think that it wouldn't be extensive within Orthodoxy. All of that is purely amateurish impressionism, and I shouldn't say anything more about it. Can I just say, the title of that book I was trying to refer to a minute ago was called The Forging of Races, the ethnic theology book I'm referring to, if anyone wants to follow that. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Back to our questions from the audience. This one's a bit longer here, but I'll just read what's been entered. Do you have any suggestions for how we as scientists, I think this is going to be primarily addressed to David, but then we can hear from the others. Any suggestions for how we as scientists can better communicate our science while at the same time acknowledging our worldview in its interpretation. This, of course, would require us to understand when we bring our worldview into our data interpretation. Comments on that are welcome too. The historical story you are telling us is persuasive, interesting, and important. How do we engage in the cutting edge without the benefit of seeing us now in 50, 100, 500 years from now? What lessons can we learn, David?
Well, thank you for whoever sent that in. If I ever could answer that question, I would be retiring fully now on a large income from the sales of that book. Well, I mean, there's no simple answer to this, obviously, is there? But I think there are several steps along the way. And I suspect Alan would have something to say here about credibility and authority and so on, too. The first thing is that I don't think that history is irrelevant. I also don't think that, that you should only write history for its contemporary lessons, but at least an awareness of the degree to which, even unconsciously, a scientist might end up accepting a particular view or working within a certain tradition and so on. Seeing the wider cultural and political resonances of where we're all located, I think would be a very useful thing. I think that to think, though, that we can sort of do our pure science and then maybe we could then say something about our worldview if the conditions were actually right for that, might be something of a false dichotomy. And I think that what we need to see is that that's not just a problem for somebody who's Christian. It's exactly the same, though you don't see it so clearly in, for example, a scientist who's a Marxist. There are a whole range of major scientists who quite happily bring their Marxism to their analysis of particular problems, whether they're agricultural or genomic or whatever it might be. And it strikes me that seeing how that operates would be quite enlightening for people in a Christian tradition who want to practice their science within their own Christian framework. But I think that being conscious of these things and more aware of the ways in which these have operated in the past and being more aware, if one can be, of one's own presuppositions, political, cultural, and so on, might be a useful step in the right direction.
Yeah, Josh.
I just want to comment on that briefly. I think that there's kind of two conflicting concerns here. We want to be able to talk about the scientific evidence in a way that is trustworthy and as neutral as possible, but on the other hand, we want to explain how it's relevant to things that people care about. And so I think one thing that's really critical, I think, as scientists that are really trying to engage the public, is that we find ways to explain it in our work in really two ways and try and keep it some sort of separation, some sort of awareness of this. So we can describe things in more neutral theological language and then have reflections that are separate that might talk about that. But what we don't want to do is start importing a lot of theological assumptions into the language we use to describe the evidence if we cannot all help it. I know that on some fundamental level that's impossible to do, but at least our effort should be to try and separate those theological assumptions, those theological definitions, that theological import from what actually we're trying to observe and infer in a more neutral sense from the evidence.
Great. Thanks, Alan or Hans. Any suggestions for habits of mind or practices?
So one way I would interpret this question is in terms of C.S. Lewis's discussion of chronological snobbery and how do we avoid thinking that we at our current moment have somehow superseded all the faults and errors of those we look back on in the past. And I think, as David has already highlighted, that awareness is crucial, and some of that's going to come from reading. I think that it's going to come from reading different kinds of things outside of standard disciplinary grooves, sometimes called ruts. And also, I think being in dialogue and conversation with people as well at the same time, that it's not just about reading, but actually engaging with those ideas in an embodied way with others, where opportunities arise, and even making them habitual so that they are not something that happens only in a moment of crisis, but actually are a part of our normal intellectual lives. as we sort of continue on, even living within the sort of disciplinary enclaves that the modern university has carved us into.
Thank you so much, David, Alan, Josh, and Hans. This has been really a fantastic panel. And again, I'll express my gratitude to Jeffrey and Ian at the Creation Project, the Henry Center at Trinity International, who did a lot of work in putting this panel together. I'm sure if we were live in person again, we would be met with thunderous applause. So thank you again to our panelists. Really appreciate the conversation.